Hello, this presentation is on biobanking during an infectious disease pandemic. My name is Carol Weil, and I'm a program director at the U.S. National Cancer Institute. Please note that the presentation reflects my personal views, which are not necessarily those of others at the National Cancer Institute, the U.S. National Institutes of Health, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. To begin, I would like to pose a pandemic problem for us to discuss. Let's assume that as part of her flu monitoring research project, an investigator at your institution collects identifiable nasal swab samples from community residents who are experiencing flu-like symptoms. And she then banks these samples for future research based on a specific consent for influenza research. Just then, a pandemic with flu-like symptoms hits your local community. Your researcher, who's collected samples for flu, realizes that these samples represent a gold mine for pandemic research material. But she has no donor consent to interrogate the bank samples for this purpose. What should she do? And P.S., as you may have figured out by now, I did not make this up. This story actually happened in Seattle, Washington, in the United States. A Seattle flu researcher who was the recipient of a tremendous treasure trove of flu samples that she had just collected at the time that the pandemic hit Seattle, was interested in studying these samples to detect evidence of community spread and transmission within her local community. And when she sought to get approval to have that research conducted, she met with a lot of resistance because she did not have express consent to analyze the samples for this purpose, of course, because at the time she collected the samples, no one knew that this pandemic was going to be just around the corner. So this situation, which ended in the researcher, in fact, going forward and interrogating the samples and becoming a pariah to many in the research community, in the IRB community, while at the same time being considered a hero by others who felt that she had done the right thing to try to protect residents of her community and determine whether or not the pandemic had extended into areas that were heretofore unknown. It prompted many of us to think about ways in which collected samples, archived samples, might be utilized during a pandemic for pandemic research, even under conditions when the samples had not been collected with that purpose in mind. So the purpose of this talk and of our abstract today is to think about how to access archived samples during a pandemic under the U.S. regulatory apparatus. So first I'm going to look at the U.S. Common Rule's public health surveillance exception, which is at 45 CFR 46.102 for those of you familiar with the Common Rule. Then I'll talk a bit about de-identification as an approach to studying samples, which would render those samples not human subject research and therefore allow them to be examined without requiring any IRB review or prior consent. A third option would be to seek IRB review to waive informed consent, which under these circumstances would probably have to be done on a somewhat exigent basis. And a fourth consideration is how broad consent, if that mechanism had been used to collect the samples, would have played out in terms of enabling this researcher to then examine the samples for an unknown pandemic at the time of collection. Before we get into the weeds on these various approaches to examining the banked samples for a pandemic purpose, I want to make an observation about the Common Rule and community. We tend to think of the human subject protections in the Common Rule, and I think in most schemes internationally, as designed to protect the rights of individual research participants. But certainly in the Common Rule, and I suspect in other regulatory schemes as well, there are strains of societal and community protection and even nurturing that exist. And an example that I want to point to that I think is most profound in terms of the common rules exemplification of this is a provision in the children's subsection of the regulations, subpart D, which permits research that involves greater than minimal risk and where there is no prospect of direct benefit to individual children, but where the research is likely to yield generalizable knowledge about the child's disorder or condition. So if you think about this, the rule permits that in the case of really a very vulnerable and weak set of participants, that is sick children with a disorder or condition, the rule permits research to take place even when there is no possibility of benefit to the individual involved in the research, so long as there is a prospect of benefit to others within that child's community, that is, other sick children with that same disorder or condition. Showing, I think, that the concept of community and how we identify and consider an ethical value, this notion of community, is very, very important and is reflected in the protections that are enforced in the common rule. And of course, another provision that we're all familiar with that reflects this notion of justice within populations and reflects the value of community is the requirement at 46.111A3 that a criteria for IRB approval of any research is that subject selection be equitable. In other words, that participants be chosen from a broad swath of populations and not imposed inequitably on any particular group. So now to begin our review of possible approaches to allowing research for a pandemic purpose to take place when samples have been collected for a different purpose, I want to look first at the public health surveillance activity exception. This exception, which was revised in the final rule or the revisions to the common rule that took place in 2018, this exception surrounds a group of activities that are deemed not to be research. So unlike other exemptions in the rule, which exempt activities that are research but are considered research that will not require the protections of the common rule, public health surveillance are supposed to be activities that are not even considered research. They are activities conducted for the purpose of protecting the public health and are therefore seen as not requiring research protection because they simply are not research activities. Now that said, if you look at the preamble language in the rule that discusses this public health surveillance activity exception, the preamble language says that public health surveillance activities include, quote, collecting, analyzing, and using data to target public health and disease prevention. And if you think about that language, it really sounds an awful lot like what researchers who study medical prevention do. So it's difficult to imagine what kinds of activities really are encompassed within this public health surveillance activity that wouldn't cross the line over into what we all consider classic research activities. SACHARP, which is the Secretary's Advisory Committee on Human Research Protections, a branch of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services a think tank that is part of that department, has looked at this public health surveillance activity and stated that what it really encompasses is the concept of looking at what the purpose of the activity is. So if the purpose is a research one rather than a public health one, then that is going to dictate whether or not the public health surveillance activity applies. And in trying to decide whether you have a research purpose or a public health purpose, you would look at something like the breadth of the activity involved. Are you looking at a single activity or a group of activities that are going to take place over time? In fact, time frame seems to be a really distinguishing factor. If the activity is designed to get immediate answers to protect the public health of people, that's going to fall more into the public health surveillance frame than an activity that is designed to answer a question about how to treat patients in the future. And of course, with something like biobanking, we are always collecting samples for thoughts about future use. So it's going to be harder to argue when you're collecting samples for a bank that the activity is really a public health activity, unless, again, you have a very limited and short-term perspective for the collection. Now, another focus of the public health surveillance activity exception is that these are activities that are conducted by what is defined as a public health authority. And a public health authority is quite broad. It's not just, as you might imagine, a government entity, an agency of the federal or state or local government, but it can include any person or entity acting under a grant of authority from or contract with such public agencies. So this might include any grantee or contractor or anybody who is conducting these sorts of activities. Again, quite broad. The SACHARP, when they examined the concept of public health surveillance activities, said that single projects are more likely to be public health surveillance than projects with multiple or future activities. And again, I think this speaks to the concept that biobanking is going to be a hard sell for a public health surveillance activity, unless you're creating a very short-range data repository or biobank with a very specific purpose. Once you have a repository established, it really is likely to become a valuable research asset, as SACHARP said. And then the activities of that entity, one would be hard-pressed to say, are public health activities. Now, turning to de-identification, why is this an option for interrogating samples collected for one purpose, not a pandemic purpose, but being able to use them once a pandemic hits for pandemic research? Well, under the common rule, even with the changes that were enacted in 2018, research with de-identified samples and data is still considered not to fall within the definition of human subject research. So that means that IRB review and informed consent are not required for activities with de-identified samples. And that would mean then that if this flu researcher in our example had de-identified the samples she'd collected, she could then have successfully interrogated them for any pandemic purpose, despite the fact that she did not have consent to do so from the donors who gave the samples for her flu research. Under the 2018 requirements, however, for the future, it's worth noting that researchers, when they collect tissue, need to inform people up front whether they intend to have samples de-identified or whether it's possible that those samples could be de-identified. And if it is the case that samples could be de-identified, researchers must then tell participants in the consent that once identifiers are removed, their samples and data could be used for any purpose, even one outside of the scope of what was the initial collection purpose, without any additional consent. I personally think de-identification is not a good approach in a pandemic or, in fact, in many cases where medical research is a future possibility or a future aim. First of all, de-identified data is going to be decidedly less useful in a public health crisis. You can't then do contact tracing, you can't do good surveillance, so it makes the information that you're gathering a lot less useful for a public health service. You can't disclose any of the test results to people, and you can't enforce any protections. So that, it seems to me, is a huge negative for why you would not want to de-identify samples. It also seems decidedly unethical if you're going to collect samples for purpose A and then de-identify them without informing people and using them for purpose B. That is, in fact, why the common rule now requires that people be informed up front if their samples could be de-identified in the future, that they could, in fact, subsequently be used for purposes that they would not have the option to refuse. But when you de-identify tissue, you are automatically allowing the possibility that its use could involve situations that would not have been acceptable to the person up front. If you do it in the context of broad consent, that's quite different. But in a situation as we have here, where you had a flu researcher who collected for a specific purpose, de-identification would seem very much to lack transparency. And therefore, I think of it as quite an unethical approach. So let's turn now to the concept of waiving informed consent. How might that have worked here? If the researcher had said, I only have specific consent for flu, I need to go to the IRB and seek an emergency waiver of informed consent so that I can immediately begin testing these samples for COVID, what would she have had to show? Well, first she would have needed to show that the research involved no more than minimal risk. I think that's a pretty easy hurdle to meet here. Biospecimen research, of course, is non-interventional. The samples were already collected. There don't seem to be a lot of risk with a pandemic such as COVID. It's not a particularly stigmatizing illness. Most people are quarantining or trying to engage in social protections anyway, or a lot of us are. So it wouldn't really impose extra burdens on people. And I think the privacy risks are low. So that seems like a task that's not too insurmountable to meet. You'd also need to show that the research could not practically be carried out without waiving consent. Again, I think that is a pretty easy sell here, since these samples had been just collected. They, particularly if you were going to not be able to use the public health surveillance exception, there would be no other way to make use of this important treasure trove of samples to conduct the research. Could the research have been carried out without using the samples donated in an identifiable format? Again, if the goal is to protect the public health, to allow for contact tracing and quarantining of infected individuals, then no, you would need to have the identifiable data attached to them. So again, not hard to meet that burden. And would the waiver adversely affect the rights and the welfare of the subjects? I think it probably not. Most people who are quarantining already have already experienced whatever loss of liberty that they would. Hearing that they're infected would probably be viewed as a benefit and welcomed information, rather than something that was imposing an additional burden or loss of liberty. And there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of stigma attached to this pandemic, although I will say I did come across this in the New Yorker, that there has been some online shaming of people. I'm not sure that's so much related to people who have COVID as related to people who are not taking adequate protections to ensure the protection of other people, whether or not they actually have symptoms of the disease or have been tested positive for the disease. But nonetheless, there is some suggestion that even in a pandemic like COVID, there is some stigma attached. And certainly if you think of something along the lines of AIDS or other crises, medical crises that have affected our planet, there are definitely diseases that can be widespread that would be potentially stigmatizing. So that is certainly something to consider. But I think overall, waiver of informed consent is a good option to use in a situation that our flu researcher found herself in, if the public health surveillance exemption was not going to be available. And finally, we want to look at whether or not broad consent would have helped this researcher had she collected the samples initially under a broad consent rather than a specific consent for flu research. So first thing to note, there are two types of broad consent. There is the broad consent that is a regulatory broad consent in the 2018 revisions to the final rule. And then there is what I will call classic or old-timey broad consent, because it's been around for so long, which really reflects the optional tissue collection protocols that we see in clinical trial consents and other clinical research studies that say things like, we would like to collect and save some of your extra tissue for future research. Please let us know if this is acceptable to you. We can't tell you all the different kinds of research this will involve, but it will generally involve cancer research, or it will involve medical research, that sort of thing. So those sorts of broad consent, the old concept of broad consent before the common rule was revised to include a broad consent pathway. So turning first to the regulatory broad consent pathway in the final rule, what that provision states is that when secondary research is being conducted with identifiable samples that have been collected under this pathway, the IRB only has a limited scope of review. The IRB needs to determine that the new research is within the scope of whatever that broad consent language was. So if it says something like medical research or research on certain diseases, you need to make sure that the pandemic would have been included in that. And then secondly, if you plan to return research results to people, then this broad consent pathway is not available. You need to obtain full board review, and you cannot do this limited review for broad consent. So those are the guts of the broad consent pathway. The real problem with this option is that it is very costly, and the infrastructure makes it highly impractical, mainly due to the consequences of what happens when a participant refuses broad consent. If a participant refuses broad consent, then their collected data and samples cannot be used for any purpose whatsoever, even a completely innocuous one like a tissue staining study or something of that sort. And so when an institution decides to avail itself of the broad consent option, it needs to make sure that it can completely and utterly embargo the samples of anyone who refuses broad consent. And that can be very difficult for a small institution or an institution that isn't networked. If you have a very large healthcare delivery / insurance apparatus that is all interconnected with medical records and highly networked, it's possible. But for most institutions to embargo successfully someone's data and samples when they refuse broad consent, it's quite difficult and quite costly. And so that's really made this broad consent provision very, very not user-friendly. And therefore, there's been very little uptake for it. So turning now to the more classic, or what I call old-timey broad consent, what would that have done for this flu researcher in terms of her ability to interrogate the samples for COVID? Well, if you think about it, broad consent could pose some recruitment challenges during a pandemic, especially if you're approaching individuals who are part of groups or communities that have been historically disenfranchised or wronged by past research abuses, because they tend to be very suspicious and skeptical of the entire research apparatus from the get-go. So it might endanger your recruitment. That is something to think about. And there is the potential for stigmatizing research studies in the future, such as linking COVID to certain undesirable behavioral or cultural traits. And this is particularly concerning in a situation that we find ourselves in with COVID, which is that it has disproportionately affected minority and underserved ethnic and racial groups. So those are things to think about. And there is then a further issue with the requirement in the Common Rule to disclose commercial profit. One of the interesting things about this pandemic is how infused the public and the private funding for research has become during this era of COVID-19. So under the Common Rule, researchers are required to disclose if there is a potential that a subject's biological samples, even if identifiers are removed, if there's any potential that the subject's biospecimens may be used for a commercial purpose, that needs to be disclosed. And it also needs to be disclosed whether or not the research participant will share in the profit. This is a requirement in the rules. And when you think about a disease like COVID and the research efforts that have been employed for that disease, most of the efforts have been quite a hybrid of industry and government. So we have, for example, the coronavirus vaccine efforts, we have efforts for therapeutics. They are all essentially a hybrid of government and private efforts. And so to state with any definitive knowledge whether or not future research will involve commercial profit is difficult to do. So that's just something potentially unique for Operation Warp Speed and COVID, but I think that this is a model that might be used in future pandemics as well, because anytime there's a critical and time-sensitive need to get research answers, you can imagine that there's going to be a lot of partnering by government and private enterprise. So this does seem like a situation that would repeat itself for future pandemics. And so some concluding thoughts on options for approaching the need to conduct research during a pandemic when samples have been collected for a different purpose. With respect to archive samples, I do think that the public health exception should apply and should be able to be employed in cases where there is an immediate and critical human protection activity that needs to be done. Something like tracking or tracing or an immediate public health interest. I think that will likely fall within the public health exception. And I think researchers and institutions should be able to feel confident employing that exception to avoid IRB review. If there is concern or doubt that a particular activity is in fact such an immediate and critical human protection activity, and there is a desire to have some sort of human subject protection applied, I think an IRB waiver of informed consent is a good route to go. And then in terms of collecting samples during a pandemic for the future, I would advise that adding a standard consent pandemic provision just seems like a prudent course of action. It shouldn't have to be in there, and of course wasn't for this particular flu researcher in Seattle, and she was forced to deal with other options. But if you had a pandemic provision in a consent form, and if this became a routine, and perhaps should become a routine now that we've gone through this era of COVID-19, it seems like a better way to ensure that the research and other public health and the research and public health activities that need to be conducted can in fact go forth without any regulatory hurdles. In addition, if you have a consent provision that is specific to pandemic research, it seems a lot more respectful, which is what the human subject protection regulations are designed to be about. It seems more respectful to individual participants to inform them up front that you may be studying their samples for pandemic research. And I don't think this is likely to interfere with recruitment efforts because most participants who are inclined to engage in medical research at all would likely respond positively to the idea that their samples, in addition to whatever other research purpose they are going to be used for, could be used to save lives during a pandemic. It's imminently life-saving. This is not controversial research typically, so I think that adding a pandemic provision would not undermine biobank recruitment efforts.